My name's Noah Matthews, and for the last 6 years, I've been backpacking across America. Not the vacation version of it either. I'm not talking about staying in nice cabins, taking pictures at national parks, or posting sunsets online. I mean actual backpacking. Sleeping in cheap motels when I could afford them, sleeping in campgrounds when I couldn't, walking highways with 40 pounds strapped to my back because the next town was still another 15 miles away. Most of the time, I made money however I could. Construction cleanup in Oklahoma, unloading trucks outside Dallas, washing dishes at a diner in Idaho for 3 weeks because my boots had fallen apart and I needed enough cash for new ones. I spent almost 4 months one year cleaning campsites at a state park in Oregon just because they let me sleep in an old maintenance shed behind the ranger station. A lot of people think that kind of lifestyle sounds relaxing. It's not. Most days are uncomfortable. You're hot, tired, dirty, and constantly trying to figure out where you're sleeping next. You notice things normal travelers don't notice either. Which gas stations feel safe, which towns empty out after dark, which stretches of highway don't have fences because too many people have crashed there already. You also learn very quickly that America is way bigger than most people realize. People who fly everywhere, they don't understand that. Neither do people who stay inside cities their whole lives. Once you start moving through the country slowly, actually walking through parts of it, you realize how much empty space there really is out there. Nevada almost feels endless. You can stand next to a highway at 2 a.m. with nothing around you except dirt, mountains, and old telephone poles stretching off into darkness. No houses or lights or people, just empty land going on for miles in every direction. Montana's even worse in some places. I spent 3 days hiking through part of western Montana once without seeing another person besides a ranger near the trailhead. Just forest, rivers, and old roads disappearing into trees. You start hearing every sound differently after a while when you're alone that long. A branch snapping at night doesn't sound small anymore. An animal moving through brush suddenly sounds huge. Washington State has areas like that too. Giant forest where the fog hangs low enough that you can see 20 or 30 feet ahead of you. Places where everything smells wet all the time, and the trees are so tall they block most of the sunlight even during the afternoon. Arizona scared me in a completely different way. The deserts out there feel dead at night. Not quiet, dead. You'll drive for an hour and pass maybe 2 cars. Half the gas stations look abandoned, even when they're technically open. I remember standing outside one near Flagstaff around midnight and realizing I hadn't seen another person in almost 40 minutes. That starts getting into your head after a while. Not because you think something's gonna attack you every second, but because you realize how easy it would be for something bad to happen out there. Now, most people assume the dangerous part of backpacking is serial killers or gangs or something. Honestly, I barely even dealt with that kind of thing. Most people I met were normal. Truck drivers, old couples, college kids, construction workers, tired people just trying to get somewhere. But every once in a while, you'd meet somebody that immediately felt different. Strange. Worse than that sometimes. The kind of person that makes your stomach tighten before they even say anything. And then there were the places themselves. That's the part I still think about the most years later. Certain roads, campgrounds, sections of forest. Places where something happened and there wasn't really a good explanation for it afterward. I still backpack now. Not as much as I used to, but enough. Still like moving around. Still like seeing different parts of the country. But there are things I won't do anymore. I don't hitchhike after dark unless I absolutely have to. I don't camp alone in isolated campgrounds if there's nobody else around. And if a ranger tells me not to go somewhere, I listen now. Because after enough time traveling across America, you realize there are places out there where something could happen to you. And nobody would ever really know what it was. By the time I got stranded outside Flagstaff, I'd already been on the road for almost 3 weeks straight. I'd started in New Mexico, cut west through Arizona, and planned to make my way toward Nevada after stopping near Flagstaff for a couple days. At that point, I was running low on money. My shoulders were killing me from carrying my pack non-stop, and one of my boots had started separating near the heel. I remember it was colder than I expected too. There's something people don't realize about Arizona. They picture heat and deserts, but northern Arizona gets cold once the sun goes down, especially near the mountains. By the time everything rolled around, the temperature had dropped enough that I'd already put my hoodie back on under my jacket. I'd been trying to get a ride for almost an hour. The gas station I was standing near barely looked operational. Half the lights on the sign were burned out, and the place sat by itself next to a long stretch of highway with nothing around it except dirt and old fencing. The clerk inside looked about 80 years old and hadn't spoken a single word to me, besides telling me the bathroom key was around back. Cars passed every few minutes, but nobody stopped. I was starting to think I'd either need to sleep behind the building or walk another 6 or 7 miles to the next exit when I saw the Buick. It was an older white sedan. Clean though. Really clean. The paint almost reflected silver under the gas station lights. The car slowed as it passed me, then stopped about 30 feet ahead. I grabbed my backpack and walked toward it carefully. The passenger window rolled down halfway, and an older woman leaned slightly toward me from behind the wheel. Looked to be maybe in her 70s. Thin gray hair, small frame, pale skin. She wore a light blue sweater and had both hands resting neatly on the steering wheel. "Need a ride?" she asked softly. "Yeah," I said, "if you're heading towards Flagstaff." "Oh, I can take you part of the way." Her voice sounded normal, calm, friendly. I thanked her and climbed in. The inside of the Buick smelled faintly like lavender and dust. Not dirty exactly, just old, like a house that hadn't changed in 20 years. As soon as I shut the door, she smiled at me. Not a quick smile either, a long one. "You're a long way from home." "Yeah, I guess so." "You backpacking?" "Yeah." She nodded slowly. "My grandson used to do that." I set my backpack between my feet while she pulled back onto the highway. For the first few minutes, everything felt normal enough. She asked where I was from, how long I'd been traveling, whether I liked Arizona. The usual stuff. Then she asked if I was married. "No." "Girlfriend?" "No." She nodded again. "My grandson wasn't married either." I glanced toward her briefly. She was still smiling. "His name was Barry. You remind me of him." "That's so." "Oh, very much." I gave a polite smile and looked back out the windshield. The highway ahead was almost completely dark, except for the Buick's headlights and the occasional distant glow from another car. Most of the land around us was empty. Long stretches of open ground and low hills just disappearing into darkness. "You really do look like him," she said again after a while. Something about the way she said it made me shift slightly in my seat. Not because it sounded threatening, it sounded strange. "Barry liked traveling too. Never stayed in one place too long." I nodded politely. "He disappeared, you know." "Oh, I'm sorry. When was that?" "Oh, years ago now." The car grew quiet again. I noticed then that she barely looked at the road. Most people glance back and forth naturally while driving. Mirrors, lanes, headlights. She didn't. She mostly looked straight ahead. Except every so often she'd turn and look directly at me for a second before facing forward again. "You have the same eyes," she said quietly. And that tightening feeling started in my stomach right around then. I remember looking toward the passenger window, realizing we hadn't passed another car in several minutes. The road felt emptier than before. The inside of the Buick felt colder, too. At first I thought maybe she'd turn the air on somehow, but when I looked down, the vents weren't blowing anything. You okay? Yeah. You got quiet. Oh, I'm just tired. I understand. She reached over suddenly and touched my forearm, and her hand felt freezing cold. The kind of cold that instantly stands out against your skin. I pulled my arm back without really meaning to. She slowly returned her hand to the wheel. Barry used to do that too, she said. Something in my head started telling me I needed to get out of that car immediately. I tried calming myself down at first. She was probably just a little lonely, you know? My brain was trying to turn an awkward car ride into something scary because I'd been traveling alone too long. Then she spoke again. I always hoped he'd come back someday. I didn't answer this time. Outside, I finally saw traffic lights ahead in the distance near an intersection, and relief hit me almost instantly. More lights, more people. The Buick slowed gradually as we approached the red light, and that's when I noticed she was smiling again. Wider now. The car rolled to a stop, and then very slowly she turned her head toward me. And I still remember exactly what I saw. Her eyes were gone. Not damaged or bloodshot. Gone. Just empty black sockets, staring directly back at me while she smiled. My entire body locked up for about half a second, and then I grabbed the handle and shoved the passenger door open. I got out so fast I almost fell into the road. A horn blasted somewhere behind me as I stumbled backward away from the Buick. My backpack slammed against the side of the car as I backed toward the sidewalk near the intersection. The old woman never moved. She just sat there with both hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, still smiling at me. Cars slowly started lining up behind the Buick at the light. Nobody else seemed to notice anything wrong. I remember hearing another horn, then another. The light turned green. For several seconds, the Buick didn't move. And then finally, slowly, it rolled forward through the intersection. I stood there breathing hard while the car drove away down the highway. The taillights got farther and farther away. Then they started dimming. At first I thought maybe the road curved, but it didn't. The taillights just kept fading weaker and weaker until eventually they disappeared completely into the darkness ahead. No turn or exit, just gone. I ended up getting a motel room that night, about 2 miles away, after walking the rest of the way into town. I barely slept. Around 3 in the morning, I started searching online for missing persons cases around Flagstaff, mostly because I couldn't stop thinking about the grandson she mentioned, Barry. Eventually, I found an old article from the late 80s about a missing college student named Barry Collins, who disappeared while driving home outside Flagstaff in 1987. There was a picture attached to the article. And honestly, I did look like him. Not totally, not enough to matter normally, but enough that the similarity made my stomach drop when I saw it. I shut my laptop right after that, and I never stood on a roadside after dark near Flagstaff again. I met Dennis Warren outside Tonopah, Nevada, sometime around late October. That entire stretch still makes me uneasy when I think about it. Northern Arizona feels isolated, but Nevada feels empty in a completely different way. There are huge sections of highway out there where it honestly seems like the rest of the world just stops existing. No towns or buildings, sometimes not even fences. Just dirt, rock, and mountains sitting under endless sky. I'd been walking alongside the highway for almost an hour when Dennis picked me up. The sun had already started dropping behind the mountains, and the desert was turning that dark blue color everything gets right before night fully sets in. I remember the wind, too. Cold and dry enough that my lips were cracked from it. Dennis pulled over in an older red pickup truck about 50 yards ahead of me. The truck itself looked rough but functional. Mud splashed along the sides, one headlight dimmer than the other, the bed stacked with plastic containers, and old camping gear tied down beneath a faded tarp. I walked up carefully and leaned down toward the passenger window. Driver was probably in his late 50s. Thin build, sunburned face, gray stubble. Cleveland Indians baseball cap, pulled low. "You headed west?" he asked. "Yeah." "Hop in?" I thanked him and climbed inside. The truck smelled faintly like gasoline and old coffee. The dashboard was cluttered with random stuff. Maps, batteries, empty wrappers, notebooks, loose flashlight parts. I also noticed 3 handheld radios mounted near the center console. Dennis pulled back onto the highway without another word. And for the first couple minutes, the ride felt normal enough. He asked where I was from, how long I'd been backpacking, whether I'd been through here before. Then he asked, "You ever seen lights out there?" I glanced over at him. What kind of lights?" He shrugged slightly. "Strange ones." I remember giving him one of those polite half-laughs people do when they don't really want to commit to a conversation. "No," I said. Dennis nodded slowly. "They're out here." And that was the first moment I realized, this guy might be a little off. Still, I'd met weird people before. That comes with traveling constantly. Truck drivers telling ghost stories. Guys at campgrounds talking about Bigfoot after 6 beers. Usually you just nod and let them talk. Dennis kept one hand on the wheel while the truck rolled through long, empty stretches of highway. "You know how many people disappear in Nevada every year?" he asked. "No idea." "A lot," he said. I looked back out the windshield. The road ahead was almost completely empty now. Darkness settling over everything fast. Mountains turning into black shapes against the horizon. Dennis continued talking. People think it's because they get lost. Heat stroke, dehydration, stuff like that." He shook his head. "That's not always what happens." I stayed quiet. The truck rattled slightly as we crossed uneven pavement. Dennis tapped 2 fingers against the steering wheel. "You ever been near Rachel?" "What's Rachel?" "Oh, it's an old mining town." He pointed vaguely north toward darkness. "It's mostly abandoned now." "No," I said. "Good." Something about the way he answered made me glance at him again. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't joking either. Just staring forward. "You camp alone much?" "Sometimes." "You shouldn't out here." "Why?" Dennis was quiet for several seconds before answering. "Things move around at night." I honestly thought he meant coyotes or mountain lions at first. And then I noticed the rifle. It was laying partially beneath a blanket on the back seat. Not hidden exactly, just there. My stomach tightened slightly. "You, hunt?" I asked. Dennis glanced at me briefly. "Oh, sometimes." And that answer didn't make me feel any better. The truck kept moving west through darkness, while the headlights carved through endless empty road ahead. Then Dennis asked, "You ever see anything strange while traveling?" I shrugged. "No, not really." "No lights?" "No." "No aircraft?" "No," I said. He nodded slowly again. And then, "You ever wake up somewhere and not remember getting there?" And that question immediately changed the tone inside the truck. I laughed awkwardly. "No." But Dennis didn't laugh. The truck seemed louder suddenly. Tires humming against pavement, wind rattling lightly against the doors. "You'd tell me if you did, right?" Yeah, sure. He kept staring straight ahead. I'm serious. I looked toward the passenger window again. Nothing outside except darkness and occasional roadside reflectors. That feeling started creeping into my stomach again. Same one I'd felt in Arizona. That instinct telling me something wasn't right. Dennis kept talking quietly. You know, people think UFO stories are stupid till they spend enough time out here. He tapped the steering wheel again. And then they start seeing things. Yeah? What kind of things? Oh, lights, mostly. He paused. Shapes, sometimes. The truck accelerated slightly. You know what the military tests out here? No. Neither does anybody else. Another long silence. And then Dennis looked at me sideways for a second. You know, you're very calm. What? Oh, you're calm. I shrugged. I don't know. Now, most people would have probably just asked him to let him out right there. But when you backpack long enough, you get used to weird conversations. You learn not to overreact unless you absolutely have to. Still, every instinct I had was telling me I needed to get out of that truck soon. Dennis adjusted one of the radios absent-mindedly. Static briefly went through the cab. You know what bothers me? What's that? People disappear out here all the time. He glanced toward me again. Some of them, they come back wrong. I didn't say anything. The truck kept driving faster. Nothing insane, maybe 80 now. But on those dark Nevada highways, 80 feels much faster than it sounds. Dennis kept staring at me intermittently. Finally, he asked, How long have you been awake? What? How long since you slept? I don't know, last night? He nodded slowly, like he was confirming something in his head. And then without warning, he reached beneath the driver's seat, and every muscle in my body tightened immediately. But instead of a gun, he pulled out a large flashlight. Before I could react, he clicked it on and pointed it directly into my face. The sudden brightness blinded me for a second. Dennis leaned closer slightly, while studying my eyes. Then finally he said, I knew I shouldn't have stopped. And that was enough for me. I grabbed the passenger handle immediately. The truck was entering a long curve in the highway then. Cold air exploded into the cab. And then I jumped. I hit the ground hard enough to knock the air out of my lungs instantly. My shoulders scraped against dirt and rock, while my backpack dragged me sideways across the shoulder. And for a second, all I could hear was scraping pavement and my own breathing. Then silence. I rolled over painfully, and I looked back toward the highway. The pickup had fishtailed partially sideways across the lane before straightening again. Its brake lights glowed red in the darkness for several seconds. I honestly thought Dennis might turn around. Instead, the truck slowly accelerated again and disappeared west down the highway until the taillights vanished completely. I stayed sitting in the dirt for probably 5 minutes after that, just trying to calm down. My palms were bleeding from gravel cuts, one knee torn open through my jeans, shoulder throbbing badly. But I was alive. Eventually, I walked another 4 miles before reaching a truck stop outside Tonopah around midnight. I never reported Dennis. At the time, I honestly didn't think there was much to report. Strange guy, creepy behavior. Basically it. But a few months later, I stopped at another diner while traveling through Utah, and I saw something on the wall near the entrance. Missing person flyer. Dennis Warren. The picture was him exactly. According to the flyer, his truck had been found abandoned outside Tonopah 2 months earlier. No sign of Dennis anywhere nearby. I remember standing there looking at that flyer for a long time. And honestly, I wonder what he saw out there in the desert. And I wonder what happened to him. By the time I reached Olympic National Park, I'd already been backpacking through Washington for almost 2 weeks. Washington's beautiful, but parts of it, they honestly feel prehistoric. The forest out there, they're different from anywhere else I've been in America. Everything feels oversized. The trees are massive, the ferns come up to your chest in some places, and the fog hangs low enough that entire sections of trail disappear into white haze 20 feet out of you. The air always feels wet, too, even when it isn't raining. I started the trail early in the morning after spending 2 nights at a campground near Port Angeles. The ranger station sat near the trailhead, and I remember the ranger speaking to me for a few minutes while I adjusted my backpack. His name was Bradley Hayes, mid-40s maybe, beard, green rain jacket, calm guy. "You hiking alone?" he asked. "Yeah." "How far ain't you going?" "Oh, a couple days, probably." He nodded. "All right, stand marked trails. Mountain lions active up there lately." "You seen one?" I asked. "Tracks. And don't hike after dark if you can avoid it." I remember laughing lightly. Yeah, wasn't planning on it. He gave a small smile, but didn't laugh back. And that should have been enough warning, honestly. The first several hours were normal. Cold air, fog drifting through trees, birds occasionally moving through branches overhead. The trail itself wound through dense forest with almost no visibility off either side. Sometimes you could hear water moving somewhere nearby, without ever actually seeing it. Other times the woods went completely silent, except for your own footsteps. I only passed 2 other hikers the entire day. And that was another part that started bothering me after a while. How empty the trail felt. Most national parks have at least some traffic during the day, but once I got farther into the forest, it felt like I had the entire place to myself. Around late afternoon, I stopped near a clearing to eat something and rest my shoulders. And that was when I saw the snake. At first I thought it was a fallen branch lying across the trail, maybe 30 yards out of me. And then it moved. Not fast, slow. I remember freezing immediately. The thing crossing the trail, it was enormous. I don't mean slightly bigger than normal either, I mean genuinely wrong-sized. Thick as a car tire, at least from what I could see. Dark greenish-black scales sliding silently across dirt and wet leaves. I never saw the full body, but the section I saw was already huge. The rest of it kept moving out from the brush for several more seconds afterward. Long enough that my brain stopped trying to estimate how big it actually was. The snake finally disappeared into dense ferns on the opposite side of the trail, without making almost any sound at all. And I stayed perfectly still for probably a full minute afterward. And then I slowly backed away from the trail and waited. Nothing else moved. No sound or rustling. Nothing. Eventually I convinced myself. It had to be some kind of optical illusion. Maybe, I don't know, multiple snakes crossing close together? Maybe perspective distortion from the fog? But honestly, I knew what I saw, and it was too big. I almost turned around right then. I should have. Instead, I kept hiking another few miles before setting up camp near a narrow ridge overlooking part of the forest below. The campsite itself wasn't official, just a relatively flat patch of ground surrounded by trees and moss-covered rocks. I set up my tent before sunset and ate dinner while fog drifted slowly through the woods around me. By full dark, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Everything beyond my small lantern light disappeared into gray haze. That feeling of isolation started creeping in hard around then. No voices or distant traffic or planes overhead. Nothing. Just trees and darkness stretching forever in every direction. I eventually crawled into my tent around 10 and fell asleep pretty quickly. And then sometime later I woke up. First, I didn't know why. Everything was still dark except for faint moonlight glowing through the tent fabric. And then I heard it. A heavy footstep somewhere outside. Not close right away. Maybe 30 or 40 feet from the tent. But heavy enough that I felt my entire body tense instantly. I stayed perfectly still while listening. Another step, then another. Much heavier than a person walking normally. My first thought was bear. That made the most sense. But something about the rhythm bothered me. Bears move differently. Then I heard branches crack. Not small twigs either, large branches. I remember gripping my flashlight while staring toward the tent wall nearest the sound. The footsteps stopped suddenly. Silence filled the forest again. And then I heard breathing. Close enough now that I could hear air moving through nostrils. I didn't move. Didn't unzip the tent or make noise. Every instinct I had told me not to look outside. The breathing stayed there for maybe 20 seconds. And then finally the footsteps started moving again, slowly circling away through the trees. Eventually the sounds faded completely. I barely slept the rest of the night. By sunrise, I'd convinced myself it probably had been a bear after all. That explanation lasted until the following evening. I'd spent most of the day hiking through increasingly steep terrain until I eventually reached a ridge overlooking part of the mountainside below. The fog had finally started thinning somewhat, and orange sunlight stretched across the tops of the trees. And that was when I saw the eyes. At first they looked distant. 2 orange points glowing far across the mountainside below me. Too far apart. That registered immediately. Normal animals don't have eyes spaced that wide. I stopped walking instantly. The eyes didn't move. They just stared upward toward me from the trees below. My brain tried rationalizing it immediately. Reflection, maybe? Some strange angle of sunlight. And then one of the eyes blinked. A cold feeling spread through my stomach immediately. The eyes stayed fixed on me another few seconds. Then they vanished. It wasn't gradual, it was instant. I stood there frozen on the ridge, trying to process what I'd just seen. And then maybe a minute later, I saw them again. Much closer now, farther downhill. My body went cold. There was no way something that large should have moved that distance that quickly through terrain like that. I backed away immediately. The eyes stayed fixed on me from between the trees, watching. I turned and started moving back down the trail fast. Not running fully yet, but I was close. The forest suddenly felt much darker than before. Much quieter, too. And then somewhere off to my left, I heard branches breaking again. Closer than before. At one point, I glanced sideways through the trees, and I saw something dark moving between trunks uphill from me. It was too large and too tall, but I never got a clean look at it. I started running after that. My backpack slammed painfully against my shoulders while I pushed downhill through fog and fading light as fast as I could move. The sounds kept following through the trees beside me the entire way down, sometimes close, sometimes farther away, but they were always there. By the time I reached the ranger station again, it was fully dark. Bradley Hayes was still inside finishing paperwork when I came through the door breathing hard. He stood up immediately. "You all right?" Yeah, something followed me." "What'd you see?" I described the eyes first. Too wide apart, too high off the ground. Bradley listened without interrupting. Then finally he asked, "Orange or yellow?" I frowned slightly. Orange." He nodded, actually looked relieved. And then he quietly said, "You were lucky." I remember waiting for him to explain further, but he never did. The campground sat around 40 minutes north of Missoula, Montana, tucked deep inside a stretch of forest I don't even remember the name of anymore. I found it completely by accident. At that point, I'd been hiking most of the day through a network of trails that were way rougher than I expected. My legs were shot, my shoulders hurt, and I was running low on water. I remember checking my phone around sunset and realizing I hadn't had service for almost 8 hours. That already put me in a bad mood. The farther north you go in parts of Montana, the more isolated everything starts feeling. Roads get narrower, towns get farther apart. Some stretches of forest feel genuinely endless. I reached the campground right before dark. There were only 3 campsites near the entrance loop. 2 of them looked empty. No cars or lanterns, nothing. The 3rd site had people. I remember seeing the fire first through the trees. Orange light flickering between trunks while smoke drifted upward into darkness. At first I planned on just finding my own spot farther away, but the man near the fire noticed me almost immediately and waved. "Hey, you looking for a place to camp?" he called out. "Probably." You can set up near us if you want. The whole campground's empty." I walked closer carefully. The family looked completely normal. The father introduced himself as Adam Foster. Mid-30s, probably. Tall guy, dark hair, flannel jacket. His wife, Kelly Foster, sat beside the fire wrapped in a thick sweater while their daughter colored something at the picnic table nearby. The girl looked around 8 or 9 years old. "My name's Noah," I said. "Oh, you hiking through?" Adam asked. "Yeah." "Well, you picked a cold night for it." He wasn't wrong. The temperature had already started dropping fast once the sun disappeared behind the trees. I thanked him for letting me stop, and I set my backpack near the edge of the campsite. Everything about the family felt normal. Honestly, after weeks of traveling mostly alone, sitting near another group of people, it's nice, it's relaxing. Adam handed me a cup of coffee while I unpacked some food from my bag. "So, you been through Montana before?" "Not really." "Well, you picked the right time of the year," Kelly chimed in softly. "Gets crowded earlier in summer." Something about the way she talked felt slightly old-fashioned maybe, but not enough that I thought much about it then. The daughter kept coloring quietly while the adults talked. At one point, she held up her paper toward me. "Look." It was a drawing of trees beside a lake. "Oh, that's pretty good," I said. "She draws constantly," Adam said with a smile. The fire crackled while darkness settled fully over the campground around us. I remember noticing how quiet everything felt. Just forest. Adam talked about fishing nearby streams, while Kelly asked me about traveling, where I'd been, what states I liked most, whether I planned on heading farther north. The conversation felt easy, comfortable, and honestly, after sleeping alone for so many nights beforehand, I probably relaxed more than I should have. There were small details that did seem odd in hindsight. Their camping gear looked old, not dirty or damaged, just very outdated. The lantern hanging beside their picnic table looked ancient. Same with the cooler near the fire pit. Even their clothes felt slightly out of place somehow. Nothing obvious enough to immediately stand out, but enough that later my brain kept replaying it. At one point, Adam asked if I wanted some stew they'd made. I politely declined and heated one of my own canned meals instead. The daughter had fallen asleep inside one of the tents by then, while Kelly cleaned up dishes near the tent. Eventually, Adam stood and stretched. "Well, we're turning in," he said. "We've got a long drive tomorrow." I nodded. Thanks again for letting me stay here." "Oh, it's not a problem. It's nice to have a new face around here," he said. Kelly smiled politely at me before disappearing into the tent beside her daughter. Adam flipped the flap shut behind him. And after that, the campground became silent again. I sat beside the fire another 20 minutes, eating soup from a small metal pot while the flames burned lower. The woods around the campsite looked pitch black beyond the firelight. At some point, I checked my phone again out of habit. Still no signal. I eventually crawled into my own tent and fell asleep pretty quickly. And then sometime later, I woke up hungry again. That happens sometimes when you hike all day carrying weight. Your body burns through food fast. I checked my phone. 12:47 a.m. The campground outside looked completely dark, except for faint moonlight filtering through trees. I climbed out quietly so I wouldn't wake the family, and I started reheating another can of soup over the fire. Everything felt cold and still. The Foster family's tents sat quietly about 20 feet away. I remember staring into the fire for a while listening to the wood crackle when headlights suddenly swept through the trees. A vehicle rolled slowly into the campground loop. White Ranger truck. It stopped near the entrance to the campsite. The driver door opened, and an older ranger stepped out holding a flashlight. Gray beard, heavy jacket. He looked surprised when he saw me sitting there alone. "You camping here?" he asked. "Yeah." The ranger glanced around slowly. "You, by yourself?" I frowned slightly. No, there's a family right over there that let me stay." I pointed toward the tents. The ranger's expression changed immediately. "What family?" "The Fosters," I said. He stared at me for a second, and then slowly aimed his flashlight toward the campsite. The beam swept across the tents. No movement. The ranger walked closer. I stood up immediately, suddenly feeling uneasy for reasons I couldn't fully explain yet. The flashlight beam moved slowly across the ground, then across the picnic table toward the tents. One of them sat partially unzipped, completely dark inside. The ranger approached carefully and pulled the flap open further. Empty. Not messy or disturbed, just completely empty. "That's impossible," I said. The ranger turned toward me. "You said they invited you here." "Yeah." "How long ago was that?" A few hours, maybe." He moved toward the second tent, opened it, and it was also empty. I walked closer now, completely confused. The campsite still looked occupied. Sleeping bags, blankets, food containers, clothes. Even the daughter's crayons still sat on the picnic table, exactly where she'd left them earlier. The ranger crouched beside the table and picked up a leather wallet sitting near one of the lanterns. He opened it slowly, and his entire expression hardened. "What is it?" I asked. He looked up at me. The ranger removed an old driver's license from the wallet and stared at it under his flashlight. And then he pulled a second ID from the purse sitting near the bench. He looked visibly disturbed now. "What is it?" I asked. Finally, he handed me the first license. The picture showed Adam Foster. Same face, same man. But the license looked ancient. It was old. The issue date read 1951. I stared at it for several seconds before looking up again. The ranger didn't say anything. Instead, he walked toward the second tent and unzipped it further. Inside sat more clothing, old bags, a child stuffed animal. Everything looked untouched, like people had simply vanished in the middle of camping. The ranger looked directly at me then. "Pack your things." What's going on?" "Just pack," he said. I started shoving items into my backpack quickly, while the ranger kept scanning the woods with his flashlight. He got us inside the truck fast and locked the doors immediately after climbing in. As we pulled away from the campground, I looked back once through the side window. The campsite still sat exactly where we'd left it. Fire burning low, lantern hanging beside the table. Tents unmoving in darkness. Empty. The ranger didn't speak for almost 10 minutes while we drove, but finally I asked, "What the hell was that?" He kept both hands tight on the wheel. You said they called themselves the Fosters. Yeah, I said. He nodded once slowly. And then he said, there was a family disappeared from this campground in 1952. Parents and a daughter. He glanced briefly toward me. They were never found. Neither of us spoke the rest of the drive back toward the ranger station. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I searched the case online from a diner outside Missoula. And sure enough, there it was. The Foster family. Missing since 1952. 3 people vanished from a campground north of Missoula without any explanation. I still backpack. Not as much as I used to, but enough. Every once in a while, I'll still throw a pack in the back of a bus, head somewhere random, and spend a few weeks moving from town to town. Part of me still loves it. I like waking up somewhere new. I like small diners in the middle of nowhere, and old highways cutting through mountains and desert. I like meeting people I'll probably never see again. But I travel differently now. There are rules I follow that I didn't used to. I don't hitchhike after dark anymore. I don't camp in isolated campgrounds if there's nobody else around. And if something feels wrong, I leave immediately. I don't stand there trying to rationalize it anymore. That's one thing traveling taught me better than anything else. Your instincts notice things before your brain catches up. The old woman outside Flagstaff. Dennis Warren in Nevada. Whatever I saw moving through those woods in Washington. The Foster family in Montana. Every single time, there was a moment where part of me already knew something wasn't right. You feel it in your stomach first. A conversation lasts slightly too long. Someone smiles too much. A forest suddenly goes quiet. A place feels very empty. Most people ignore those feelings because they don't want to seem paranoid. And I used to ignore them too. Not anymore. The other thing backpacking taught me is how unbelievably huge America really is. People see maps every day, but they don't actually understand the scale of the country until they spend time crossing it slowly. There are roads out west where you can drive for hours without seeing another town. Forest in Washington and Montana where a person could disappear 20 feet off trail and never be found. Tiny gas stations in the desert where nobody would remember your face an hour after you left. That starts getting into your head after a while, especially at night, especially when you're alone. I think that's why some of these experiences still bother me years later. Not because I have complete proof of anything supernatural. Honestly, I don't even know what some of those situations were. Maybe the woman near Flagstaff was something paranormal. I mean, it did look like she was missing her eyes. But maybe she wasn't. Maybe Dennis Warren was just losing his mind alone out in the desert. Maybe there really was something moving through forest in Washington. I don't know what these things were for sure. I just don't. Most scary experiences eventually make sense afterward. You calm down, think it through, and you realize there was a logical explanation the whole time. But every once in a while, something happens that never settles correctly in your memory. No explanation ever fully fits. You move on with your life, but part of your brain keeps going back to it anyway, trying to understand what you actually saw that night. I think that's what years of backpacking really taught me. America is full of beautiful places, lonely places, and strange places. And sometimes out on some empty road or deep in the woods somewhere, you run into something you were never supposed to cross paths with in the first place.